The encounter at the diner. The mid-afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Joe's diner, casting golden streaks onto the checkered floor. It was a quiet time of day. The hum of conversation subdued, broken occasionally by the clinking of cutlery against plates. Among the patrons was James Carter, a middle-aged black man, sitting at a corner booth near the window. He wore a neatly pressed shirt and jeans, his demeanor calm and composed as he savored the warmth of a coffee mug in his hands. On the table beside him rested his wallet and an old, slightly faded military ID. The edges frayed but still legible, a token of a life spent in service. James wasn't a man who sought attention. His years in the military had taught him the value of quiet observation and self-discipline. After retiring, he lived a life of peace and simplicity, far removed from the chaos of his youth. But today, fate had other plans. A quiet storm brewing. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply, announcing the arrival of two uniformed police officers. Officer Bradley and Officer Miller were regulars at the diner, known not for their charm but for their intimidating presence. Both were middle-aged, with Bradley's stocky build and Miller's wiry frame contrasting starkly. They walked in with a swagger, their eyes scanning the room like predators searching for prey. Their gaze landed on James almost immediately. The sight of him, calm, confident, unbothered, seemed to ignite something ugly in their minds. Bradley nudged Miller with a grin. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real quiet one over there," he muttered, his voice low but laced with malice. Miller chuckled, "Sitting there like he owns the place. Let's see if he's got anything to hide." The officers sauntered over to James's table, their boots thudding heavily on the tiled floor. The room seemed to tense as they approached. A waitress paused mid-step, her tray trembling slightly. James glanced up briefly, his deep brown eyes meeting Bradley's for a fraction of a second before returning to his coffee. "Afternoon," Bradley said, his tone anything but friendly. James set his cup down slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "Mind if we ask what you're doing here?" Miller added, leaning against the booth as if staking a claim on the space. James raised an eyebrow. "I'm having lunch. Is that a crime?" First sparks of tension. The room seemed to hold its breath. Bradley's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "No need to get smart, buddy. We're just doing our job." "Your job?" James asked, his voice cool. "And what exactly does my lunch have to do with your job?" The officers exchanged a look, their frustration growing. Miller straightened, crossing his arms. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here. You match the description of someone who might have been causing trouble." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Suspicious, huh? Let me guess, black, male, sitting quietly in a diner?" The air crackled with tension. Bradley's face darkened, his hands twitching as if itching to assert dominance. "Watch your tone," he growled. "We're trying to keep the peace." James's gaze hardened. "Peace? By harassing people minding their own business? Escalation." Bradley slammed his hand onto the table, causing the coffee cup to rattle. Several diners gasped, and the waitress dropped her tray with a loud clatter. "You better watch yourself," Bradley snarled. James didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I served my country for 20 years, he said evenly. "I've faced down enemies far scarier than you. So if you think you're going to intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Miller glanced at the military ID on the table, his lips pressing into a thin line. "What's this?" he asked. Snatching it up, he read the name aloud, his voice dripping with mockery. "James Carter, Vietnam veteran." "Huh? Well, that doesn't mean you get a free pass to disrespect us." "That's not disrespect," James replied. "That's the truth. And if you have a problem with it, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Bradley's face turned crimson. "That's it. Stand up. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct." A shocking revelation. James didn't move. Instead, he stared at them with a calm intensity that seemed to unnerve everyone in the room. "Disorderly conduct?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "For sitting and having lunch?" The officers pulled James roughly to his feet, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "Resisting, too," Miller added smugly. "Let's see what the judge has to say about that." As they began to escort him out, the waitress stepped forward hesitantly. "Wait, he didn't do anything wrong," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "Stay out of this," Bradley barked. But before they could drag James through the door, a deep, commanding voice broke through the tension. "You might want to think twice about this." The officers turned, startled. Standing in the doorway was an older man in a sharp suit, flanked by two individuals who exuded authority. It was Nathan Ellis, a senior FBI official, and James's former soldier from Vietnam. Nathan's eyes locked onto James, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "I suggest you release him," Nathan said coldly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The officers hesitated, their bravado faltering. "And who the hell are you?" Bradley snapped, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Nathan stepped closer, his FBI badge gleaming in the dim light. "I'm someone who doesn't take kindly to veterans being mistreated. Let him go, or I'll make sure you regret it." The room held its breath again, the tide beginning to shift. James remained silent, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. The warm smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon hung in the air at Joe's Diner, a place that had been a sanctuary for locals for decades. It wasn't fancy, but it had its charm. Red leather booths, a jukebox that occasionally sputtered to life, and walls adorned with faded photos of better times. James Carter had chosen this spot for its simplicity, a reminder of the quieter, more grounded life he sought after retiring from the military. James's fingers lightly traced the rim of his coffee mug as he stared out the window, watching the late afternoon sun bathe the streets in amber light. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. The soft murmur of conversations around him was comforting, like white noise that dulled the sharper edges of the world. On the table in front of him lay a small plate of untouched apple pie, his wallet, and his military ID. It wasn't a conscious display but rather a habit, a relic of his time in uniform when everything had its place. The arrival of trouble. The sudden jingle of the diner doorbell shattered the calm. Officer Bradley and Officer Miller strode in with the kind of authority that didn't need announcing. Their eyes swept the room like searchlights, assessing every patron with a calculated gaze. To most, they were just officers doing their rounds. But to those who had crossed their paths, their presence carried a different weight, one of intimidation. James barely looked up, but he could feel the shift in the room. Conversations quieted, heads turned away, and even the cook in the open kitchen moved with exaggerated care. James had seen men like this before. Bullies in uniform weren't unique to any era or location, and he had long learned how to spot them. "Look at that," Bradley muttered, his lips curling into a smirk as his gaze landed on James. "A real quiet type over there." Miller chuckled lowly. "Yeah, probably too quiet. Might be hiding something." They moved toward James with deliberate slowness, their boots echoing against the tiled floor. James, sensing their approach, took a sip of his coffee and set it down gently, preparing himself for what was to come. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Afternoon," Bradley said, his voice oozing false friendliness as he loomed over the booth. Miller flanked him, his posture lazy but his eyes sharp. James looked up at them calmly. "Afternoon, officers. Enjoying your meal?" Bradley continued, his tone now carrying a slight edge. "Trying to," James replied, keeping his tone neutral. The first confrontation. The exchange might have ended there if James had been someone else, someone willing to bend to their subtle intimidation. But James wasn't that man. The years had weathered him, hardened his resolve, and taught him that silence in the face of injustice only fed the flames. "What brings you here today?" Miller asked, feigning casual curiosity. James raised an eyebrow. "Lunch, that's all." Bradley's smirk widened. "Funny, you don't look like you belong here." James met his gaze without flinching. "And what does belonging look like to you, officer?" The murmur of nearby conversations ceased entirely. Diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between James and the officers. The waitress behind the counter froze, her hand hovering over the coffee pot she'd been refilling. The air was charged, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Bradley leaned in closer, his smirk fading. "You trying to get smart with me?" James didn't blink. "Not at all. Just trying to finish my lunch." Escalation and accusations. Miller, sensing his partner's rising temper, decided to escalate the situation. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the area. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" James sighed softly, leaning back in his seat. "Suspicious? No, I wouldn't. But I'd be curious to know what makes me look suspicious to you. Bradley's fist slammed onto the table, making James's coffee cup jump. The sudden motion caused the waitress to drop her tray with a loud clatter. And a collective gasp rippled through the room. Bradley's face was red, his thin veneer of professionalism cracking. "You listen here, boy," Bradley snarled, his voice low but dangerous. "We're not here to play games. Either you tell us what you're doing here, or we'll find a reason to make you." James remained unfazed, though his jaw tightened slightly at the word boy. His hands, resting on the table, were steady, but his voice carried an edge when he spoke. "I already told you what I'm doing. If that's not good enough, you'll have to do what you think is right." False arrest. Bradley's patience snapped. "That's it. Stand up," he barked. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct." "For sitting quietly and drinking coffee?" James asked, his tone incredulous but still controlled. "Resisting, too," Miller chimed in, pulling out his handcuffs. "Let's add that to the list." As Bradley reached for James's arm, his hand brushed against the military ID on the table. He paused, picking it up with a frown. "James Carter," he read aloud, "Vietnam veteran." "Huh? Well, that doesn't mean you get to disrespect us." James tilted his head, a faint trace of bitterness creeping into his voice. "I fought for this country. Same as you, maybe harder. And I don't disrespect uniforms, just the men who don't deserve to wear them." Bradley's face twisted with fury. Without another word, he yanked James to his feet and cuffed him roughly. The diners watched in stunned silence, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The waitress took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling. "He didn't do anything," she protested. "You can't just take him like that. Stay out of this," Miller snapped, glaring at her. "Unless you want to come with us too." A glimpse of hope, as the officers began to lead James toward the door. A low, steady voice cut through the tension. "I'd think twice about that if I were you." The officers turned sharply, their confidence faltering for the first time. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a sharp suit. His presence commanding, his eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the scene before settling on James. A flicker of recognition passed between them. The man stepped forward, pulling a badge from his pocket. The gold letters gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights, FBI. "I'm Nathan Ellis," he said coldly, his gaze locking onto the officers. "And you're making a big mistake." The tension in the room shifted, the power dynamic flipping in an instant. Bradley and Miller exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado evaporating. James stood silently, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. For the first time since their encounter began, the officers seemed to realize they might have underestimated the man they had tried to bully. Joe's Diner was the kind of place that felt frozen in time. Faded black and white photographs of the town's early days adorned the walls. The chrome bar stools gleamed under the soft yellow lights, and the jukebox in the corner hummed faintly with static. The patrons came and went, sharing gossip over steaming cups of coffee or quietly enjoying the diner's famous apple pie. But today, an electric tension hung in the air, though no one could pinpoint why. At a corner booth near the window, James Carter sat alone, his posture upright but relaxed, his demeanor quiet and composed. His eyes were fixed on the street outside, watching the shadows of passers-by stretch long under the sun. He looked like a man at peace, yet his surroundings seemed to bristle with unease. On his table rested the remnants of his meal, a half-eaten slice of pie and a coffee cup with a faint brown ring around the rim. Beside them, almost as an afterthought, lay his old, worn military ID, the name James Carter and the words United States Army, Vietnam veteran etched clearly on the plastic. It was a small detail, but one that carried the weight of history. The door's bell jingled sharply, breaking the diner's quiet rhythm. Officer Bradley and Officer Miller walked in, their uniforms crisp, their presence commanding. The sound of their boots against the tiled floor was heavy, deliberate, the kind that made people straighten in their seats. Bradley, broad-shouldered and intimidating, scanned the room like he was searching for something or someone. Miller, lean and wiry, followed close behind, his expression one of practiced disinterest. The two officers exuded authority, but to those who had lived long enough in the town, they were known less for keeping the peace and more for abusing their power. The target. James didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel their eyes on him, sharp and invasive, like needles pressing against his skin. The quiet conversations around the diner faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The waitress behind the counter froze mid-pour, the stream of coffee missing the cup and splashing onto the saucer. Bradley nudged Miller with his elbow and gestured subtly toward James. "There," he muttered under his breath. "What do you think his story is?" Miller smirked. "Looks like he's got all the time in the world. Probably up to no good." The two officers shared a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. They moved toward James's table, their boots thudding loudly against the floor. Every step seemed to suck the air out of the room. James didn't react. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, and set the cup down with deliberate care. When they stopped at his table, he finally looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. "Afternoon," Bradley said, his voice carrying the kind of forced friendliness that made everyone else uncomfortable. James met his gaze without flinching. "Afternoon, officers. You mind telling us what you're doing here?" Bradley continued, his tone slipping into something more accusatory. James raised an eyebrow, glancing at the remnants of his meal. "Looks like I'm having lunch." Miller crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the area. You match the description of someone we're looking for." James's lips tightened into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated. "And what exactly does this suspicious person look like?" Bradley's smirk faded, replaced by a glare. "Don't get smart with us. We're just doing our job." James leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "And I'm just sitting here having lunch. Seems like we're both doing our jobs." The first clash. The tension in the diner was thick now, suffocating. A woman in a booth across the room glanced nervously at her husband, who shook his head slightly, a silent plea for her to stay quiet. The waitress shuffled nervously behind the counter, her eyes darting toward the door. Bradley's patience was wearing thin. He placed a hand on the table, leaning in close. "You got some ID on you?" James's gaze flicked to the military ID resting on the table. He didn't move to pick it up. "Right there," he said evenly. Miller grabbed the ID, holding it up to the light like it might reveal some hidden secret. "James Carter," he read aloud. "Vietnam veteran." "Huh? That's supposed to impress us?" "It's supposed to explain why I don't have time for games," James replied, his voice steady but firm. "So if you're done, I'd like to finish my coffee." Bradley's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against the table. "You think just because you served, you're above the law?" "No," James said, leaning forward slightly, "but I think I've earned the right to drink my coffee in peace." "The arrest." Bradley straightened, his face darkening with anger. "That's it. Stand up," he snapped. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct." James's eyes narrowed slightly. "Disorderly?" he repeated, incredulous. "For sitting in a diner?" "You heard me," Bradley barked. "Get up." When James didn't immediately move, Miller grabbed his arm, yanking him to his feet. The handcuffs clicked open, and within seconds, they were around James's wrists. The sharp metallic sound was a shockwave that seemed to ripple through the room. The waitress stepped forward, her voice trembling. "He didn't do anything wrong. Stay out of this," Miller snapped, his tone cold and dismissive. "Unless you want to spend a night in a cell too." The room was silent, the other patrons too scared to intervene. James stood tall, his wrists bound but his dignity intact. He looked at Bradley and Miller with a calm that seemed almost unnerving. "You can take me," he said quietly, "but you'd better be sure about this." The turning point, as they began to drag him toward the door. The sound of another bell broke through the tension, the sharp jingle of a phone. Except it wasn't coming from the diner's wall phone. It was coming from James's pocket. Miller hesitated, reaching into James's jacket and pulling out a sleek black smartphone. Before he could say anything, the screen lit up with a name that froze them both. "Nathan Ellis, FBI." "What the hell is this?" Bradley muttered, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the screen. James smiled faintly, the first real expression he'd shown. "That's the man you'll be explaining this to," he said. "I'd answer if I were you." The cliffhanger. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Miller pressed the green button and held the phone up to his ear. "This is Officer Miller," he said, his voice uncertain. The response on the other end was sharp and immediate. "Put Carter on the line," a voice commanded. "Now." Miller's hand trembled slightly as he passed the phone to James, who took it with his cuffed hands. He held it to his ear, his eyes fixed on the two officers. "Hello, Nathan," James said, his tone casual. "Looks like I'll need your help after all." The officers' faces drained of color as James's calm smile deepened. The tide was turning, and everyone in the room could feel it, the call for justice. The handcuffs clicked shut around James Carter's wrists, the cold steel biting into his skin. Despite the sting, James's expression remained calm, his gaze locked onto Officer Bradley's face. The diner had gone completely silent, the patrons frozen in their seats. The quiet murmur of earlier had been replaced by an almost oppressive tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. James lowered his head slightly, the faintest shadow of a smile playing on his lips. Not the smile of a man resigned to his fate, but the smile of someone who knew that this was far from over. The phone call he'd just taken had changed everything. Nathan Ellis takes action. Across town, in a high-rise office overlooking the city, Nathan Ellis paced his sleek desk. His office reflected his position in the FBI, modern, orderly, and strategically placed on the top floor. A large framed certificate of commendation from his years of service hung beside a photo of his team. But his sharp, focused eyes were fixed on his phone. Nathan had only heard part of James's calm words before the call ended abruptly. But it was enough to stir him into action. He remembered James Carter vividly, not just as a soldier, but as a man who had saved his life countless times in Vietnam. To Nathan, James wasn't just a mentor or an ally, he was family. "Get me everything on the local precinct," Nathan barked to his assistant, specifically Officers Bradley and Miller. "I want their service records. Complaints, everything." The assistant nodded and hurried out, leaving Nathan alone in the room. He clenched his fists, his thoughts a whirl of anger and determination. He owed James his life, and he wasn't about to let this go unanswered. The fallout at the diner. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Bradley and Miller pushed James toward their patrol car, their confidence visibly shaken after the call. The other patrons looked on helplessly, the faint sound of someone dialing a phone breaking the silence. As James was shoved into the backseat, he finally spoke. "You think this ends here?" His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of certainty. "You're playing with fire, and you don't even realize it." Bradley turned sharply, his face twisted with anger. "Shut your mouth," he snapped, but even as he said it, there was a tremor in his voice. Inside the car, James leaned back, his expression unreadable. The distant hum of the radio filled the space, punctuated by dispatch chatter. Miller, glancing into the rearview mirror, caught James's eyes and quickly looked away. The weight of the situation was beginning to dawn on them. FBI investigation begins. Back at FBI headquarters, Nathan Ellis's team worked quickly. Within the hour, they had uncovered a treasure trove of information on Officers Bradley and Miller. Complaints of excessive force, allegations of racial profiling, and instances of falsified reports littered their records. None of it had led to disciplinary action, but the pattern was damning. Nathan leaned over the reports, his jaw tightening with every line he read. "How do men like this stay on the force?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. On the third ring, the voice of the local precinct's chief answered, wary and unsure. "This is Chief Reynolds. This is Nathan Ellis with the FBI." Nathan began, his tone clipped. "One of your officers has just arrested a decorated Vietnam veteran on what I suspect are fabricated charges. I'm going to need you to release him immediately." Reynolds stammered, caught off guard. Mr. Ellis, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. I'll need to look into." "No," Nathan interrupted sharply. "You'll release him now. And if I find any evidence of misconduct, your precinct will be under federal review by the end of the week." The line went quiet for a moment before Reynolds spoke again, his voice subdued. "Understood. I'll see to it." Confrontation at the precinct. When the patrol car pulled into the precinct parking lot, James was led inside. The officers at the front desk barely glanced up, accustomed to Bradley and Miller bringing in suspects without much question. James, however, walked with a quiet dignity that drew attention. Inside the holding area, Bradley turned to face him, his earlier bravado cracking slightly. "Hope you're ready to spend the night here," he sneered, though the confidence in his voice sounded forced. "No one's coming to save you." James tilted his head, his calm gaze fixed on Bradley. You're about to find out just how wrong you are. At that moment, the station doors burst open. Nathan Ellis strode in, flanked by two other FBI agents. His presence was commanding, his badge flashing as he approached the desk. "I'm here for James Carter," Nathan said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Where is he?" The officers behind the desk exchanged nervous glances, and one quickly gestured toward the holding area. Nathan didn't wait for permission. He marched through the station, his agents following closely. When he reached the holding area, Bradley and Miller were standing just outside James's cell. Bradley turned, his face paling at the sight of Nathan. "You must be the man who made that call," Bradley said, trying to muster some semblance of authority. "This is a police matter. This is a federal matter now." Nathan interrupted coldly. "Unlock the cell." Bradley hesitated, but Nathan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I said unlock it, or I'll have you in a cell right next to him by the end of the day." With shaking hands, Bradley fumbled with the keys and opened the door. James stepped out, his calm expression unchanged. He nodded to Nathan, a silent acknowledgement of their bond, a plan for justice. As Nathan and James walked out of the station, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Nathan turned to James, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked. James gave a small nod. "I've been through worse, but this isn't over." Nathan smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect it to be. Let's make sure these men don't get away with this." Over the next few days, the FBI launched a formal investigation into Bradley and Miller. Witnesses from the diner came forward, recounting the incident in detail. Surveillance footage from the diner, though partially obscured, corroborated James's account. As more evidence emerged, the pattern of misconduct in the precinct became undeniable. Public outcry, news of the arrest spread quickly, sparking outrage across the community. Local activists organized protests, demanding accountability not just for Bradley and Miller, but for the entire precinct. James, despite his reluctance for the spotlight, found himself at the center of the movement. He spoke at a community rally, his voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about every person who's been silenced, mistreated, and ignored. We have to stand together to make sure this doesn't happen again." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in chants of unity. A growing momentum. The investigation soon uncovered a web of corruption within the precinct, leading to the suspension of several officers and a review of dozens of past cases. Bradley and Miller faced federal charges, their actions exposed for the world to see. For James, it wasn't just about justice, it was about change. As he stood beside Nathan on the steps of the courthouse, watching the officers being led away in handcuffs, he felt a sense of closure. But more than that, he felt hope. "Thank you," Nathan said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. James smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, Nathan, but if this helps someone else, it was worth it." The clang of the holding cell door echoed through the precinct as James Carter was shoved inside. He didn't resist, didn't flinch, he simply stepped forward with a calm, steady dignity that made Officer Bradley's smug grin falter for a brief second. James sat down on the cold metal bench and folded his hands, his expression unreadable. It wasn't defiance that filled the room but something heavier, something that made even the air seem stifling. He wasn't scared, he was waiting. Bradley leaned against the bars, his knuckles white as he gripped the metal. "Let's see how tough you are when no one's coming to bail you out." James didn't look at him. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the small window at the top of the wall, where the fading sunlight painted the room in streaks of orange. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried a quiet weight. "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." The words hung in the air, challenging and certain. Bradley pushed off the bars, muttering a curse under his breath. But he didn't reply. He walked out of the room, slamming the heavy door behind him. Nathan Ellis on the warpath. Miles away in the heart of the city, Nathan Ellis was already mobilizing. The phone call from James had left little room for doubt. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate abuse of power. Nathan knew men like Bradley and Miller. He'd seen their kind in the field during Vietnam, the ones who let authority corrupt them, using it as a weapon instead of a shield. Nathan's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen, walked into his office, holding a tablet with a detailed report. "We've got it," she said, Complaints, misconduct reports, even internal memos that were buried. It's worse than we thought. Nathan scanned the files quickly, his jaw tightening with each passing line. Excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports. He muttered, how are they still on the force? Karen hesitated. Local oversight. These things get swept under the rug unless someone pushes back hard enough. Nathan looked up sharply. We're about to push back. He grabbed his phone and dialed Chief Reynolds at the precinct. The call connected after a few rings. The chief's voice wary. This is Chief Reynolds. This is Nathan Ellis, FBI. I believe you're holding a man named James Carter. Nathan began, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. Reynolds hesitated. Yes, Mr. Ellis. He was arrested earlier today on fabricated charges. Nathan interrupted. I want him released immediately. And I want a full explanation for what happened. And Chief? His voice dropped, carrying a dangerous edge. If I don't get that explanation, I'll make sure your entire precinct is under federal investigation by the end of the week. There was a long pause. Finally, Reynolds sighed, his voice resigned. I'll see to it. The interrogation. Back at the precinct, Bradley and Miller sat in the briefing room, their confidence beginning to crack as whispers spread among their colleagues about the FBI's involvement. A young officer approached cautiously, handing Bradley a note. It was short and to the point. Nathan Ellis, FBI, is here. Wants Carter released immediately. Bradley crumpled the note in his hand, his face flushing with anger. Who does this guy think he is? He muttered. Pacing the room, Miller tried to keep his composure, but his voice betrayed him. Maybe we should let him go. Just cut our losses. Bradley spun on him, his eyes blazing. You kidding me? If we let him go now, it'll look like we're admitting we screwed up. Before Miller could reply, the door swung open, and Nathan Ellis walked in. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask for permission. His sharp suit and authoritative presence made it clear he was a man used to being in charge. You too, Nathan said, pointing at Bradley and Miller. I want an explanation. Now. Bradley bristled, trying to regain control. With all due respect, this is a local matter. This is a federal matter now. Nathan snapped, cutting him off. James Carter is a decorated Vietnam veteran and a citizen with rights. Rights you trampled on when you decided to play judge and jury in that diner. Miller shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Nathan's piercing gaze. Bradley, however, stood his ground. He was being incooperative. Incooperative? Nathan repeated, his voice rising. Sitting quietly at a table is incooperative now? Drinking coffee is incooperative? Do you hear yourselves? The room was silent. Nathan stepped closer, his tone low and cold. You've made a serious mistake, and I'm going to make sure you answer for it. James's release. Minutes later, James was escorted out of his holding cell. Nathan was waiting for him, his arms crossed, his expression a mix of relief and anger. The two men exchanged a silent look, the kind of unspoken communication forged in the heat of battle. You good? Nathan asked finally. James nodded. I've been through worse. As they walked out of the precinct, the weight of the moment hit James. The whispers from officers, the sideways glances, they weren't just for him. They were for Nathan, for the power he wielded and the accountability he demanded. For the first time in a long while, James felt like justice might actually be within reach. The investigation deepens. Over the next few days, the FBI's investigation into the precinct uncovered a litany of abuses. Bradley and Miller weren't the only ones implicated. Complaints from civilians, testimonies from other officers, and buried internal reports painted a picture of systemic corruption. The precinct had been a breeding ground for unchecked power and misconduct. And James's case was the tipping point. Nathan and his team worked tirelessly, pulling late nights and early mornings to piece together the evidence. Karen, ever efficient, compiled witness statements from the diner, including the waitress who had spoken up in James's defense. There's enough here to bring the whole precinct under review, Karen said, dropping a thick folder onto Nathan's desk. But we need a public face for this. Nathan looked at the folder, then back at Karen. James Carter, he said simply. He's the key. James speaks out. Reluctantly, James agreed to speak at a press conference organized by the FBI. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as James stepped up to the podium. Nathan stood behind him, his presence a silent show of support. James took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I didn't want to be here today," he began, his voice steady but firm. "But sometimes, silence is the loudest form of consent. What happened to me wasn't just an attack on one man. It was a symptom of a broken system." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I served this country because I believed in its values. Justice, freedom, equality. But those values mean nothing if we don't hold the people in power accountable." The room erupted in applause. And for the first time in days, James felt the burden on his shoulders lighten. Momentum builds. The press conference sparked a wave of public outcry. Protests erupted across the city, demanding justice not just for James but for all victims of police misconduct. Local officials, feeling the pressure, called for reforms, and Bradley and Miller were suspended pending investigation. For Nathan, it was a victory, but he knew the fight wasn't over. "We've opened the door," he told James one evening. "Now we need to make sure it stays open." James nodded, a faint smile on his face. "We will." James Carter sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed behind him. As Bradley and Miller drove through the dimly lit streets, the rumble of the car engine was the only sound. Neither officer spoke, but James could feel their anger simmering beneath the surface. A silent storm waiting to erupt. He glanced out the window at the darkened city, his calm exterior masking a storm of his own. Years of discipline and resilience were keeping his emotions in check. But inside, a fire burned. This wasn't just about him. This was about every injustice he had fought against in his life. And every injustice still happening to others. In his pocket, the phone call to Nathan Ellis had already set the wheels in motion. He knew Nathan well enough to trust that help was coming. The memory of Nathan, the young soldier James had mentored in Vietnam, brought a small sense of solace. The bond forged in war was unbreakable, and James knew Nathan wouldn't let him down. The arrival at the precinct. When the patrol car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, the atmosphere shifted. Inside the station, the air was thick with tension. Officers moved quickly, some avoiding eye contact with Bradley and Miller as they escorted James through the building. A few glanced at him with curiosity, others with discomfort, as though they sensed something was off but didn't dare to intervene. Bradley, gripping James's arm tightly, led him into a small holding area. Miller trailed behind, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. The echo of their boots on the tiled floor reverberated through the empty hallway. "You'll sit tight here," Bradley sneered, shoving James toward the cell. "Let's see how long your little act holds up." James turned slowly to face him, his calm gaze steady and unwavering. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low but firm. "And you're not ready for what's coming." Bradley's smirk faltered, but only for a second. He slammed the cell door shut and walked away, leaving James alone in the dimly lit room. Nathan's response. Back at FBI headquarters, Nathan Ellis was a man on a mission. The moment James's call had ended, he had sprung into action. His mind raced with questions, but his resolve was unshakable. James Carter wasn't just a friend, he was a mentor, a father figure, and a hero. Nathan owed him his life. And now, he was determined to return the favor. Nathan's assistant, Karen, rushed into his office, a tablet in hand. "We've compiled the initial records on officers Bradley and Miller," she said, her tone urgent. "It's worse than we thought." Nathan snatched the tablet and began scrolling through the files. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and falsified reports filled the screen. A dozen instances stood out, each one more damning than the last. Nathan's jaw clenched as he read, his anger growing with every word. "How did this go unnoticed?" he muttered, his voice low but seething. Karen hesitated. "It didn't go unnoticed. It was ignored. The local oversight board brushed it under the rug every time." Nathan slammed the tablet onto his desk. "Not anymore." He picked up his phone and dialed Chief Reynolds at the precinct. The call connected after a few rings. The chief's voice tense. "This is Chief Reynolds. This is Nathan Ellis with the FBI." Nathan began, his voice cold and commanding. "I'm calling about James Carter, the man your officers arrested tonight." Chief Reynolds paused, clearly caught off guard. "Yes, I'm aware of the case. Mr. Ellis. He was brought in on fabricated charges." Nathan interrupted sharply. "I've already reviewed the reports on officers Bradley and Miller, and I'm telling you now. This is going to blow up in your face if you don't release him immediately." Reynolds stammered, clearly struggling to regain control of the conversation. "Mr. Ellis, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Nathan snapped. "You release him now, or I'll have your precinct under federal investigation by tomorrow morning." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Reynolds sighed, his voice subdued. "I'll look into it." "You do that," Nathan said before ending the call abruptly. Unraveling the precinct. At the precinct, the tension among the officers was palpable. Bradley and Miller sat in the break room, their earlier bravado starting to crumble. The whispers of FBI involvement had reached their ears, and the weight of their actions was beginning to sink in. "This is getting out of hand," Miller muttered, pacing the room. "If the FBI gets involved, they'll dig into everything." Bradley slammed his fist onto the table. "We didn't do anything wrong. He was disrespectful." "Disrespectful isn't a crime," Miller shot back, his voice rising. "You think they won't find out about the other cases? The ones He stopped himself, realizing too late that his words had already escaped. Bradley glared at him, but the damage was done. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Nathan arrived with 2 FBI agents in tow. His sharp suit and authoritative presence made it clear he wasn't here to negotiate. He strode past the front desk, flashing his badge, and demanded to see James Carter. The officers at the desk exchanged uneasy glances but didn't dare to argue. One of them led Nathan to the holding area, where James sat patiently in his cell. When James saw Nathan, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Took you long enough," James said, his tone light. Nathan chuckled softly, relief washing over him. "I had to make sure the cavalry was ready." "The release." Nathan turned to the officer who had accompanied him. "Unlock the cell, now." The officer hesitated, glancing back toward the hallway. "I need authorization from." "I am the authorization," Nathan snapped. "Do it." Within moments, the cell door swung open, and James stepped out. He stretched his wrists, the red marks from the cuffs still visible, but his composure was intact. Bradley and Miller appeared in the doorway, their faces pale. "What's going on here?" Bradley demanded, trying to regain control. "What's going on?" Nathan said, stepping forward. "Is that you're about to face the consequences of your actions. This is our jurisdiction." Bradley argued. "You have no right." Nathan cut him off with a glare. "I have every right, and you're about to find out just how deep that right goes." A community rises. As news of James's arrest and release spread, the community began to rally. Witnesses from the diner came forward with their accounts, and local activists organized a protest outside the precinct, demanding accountability. The whispers of corruption within the precinct turned into a roar, and the pressure on Chief Reynolds mounted. James, despite his reluctance for the spotlight, agreed to speak at the rally. Standing before a crowd of hundreds, he addressed the injustice he had faced. "This isn't just about me," James said, his voice steady but impassioned. "This is about every person who has been silenced, mistreated, and ignored. It's about standing up to the people who think they can abuse their power without consequence." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices united in a chant for justice. The investigation deepens. Over the next several days, the FBI's investigation into the precinct revealed a pattern of misconduct stretching back years. Bradley and Miller were suspended, their records scrutinized, and other officers implicated in the corruption began to crack under pressure. Nathan kept James updated on every development, their bond as strong as ever. "We're making progress," Nathan said during one late-night call. "But this is just the beginning." James nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Keep pushing. They've been getting away with this for too long." Justice and redemption. The courtroom buzzed with hushed voices, the air heavy with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches were packed with reporters, community members, and activists who had rallied behind James Carter. The trial of officers Bradley and Miller wasn't just about James anymore. It had become a landmark case symbolizing the fight against systemic racism and abuse of power. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm but resolute. Beside him was Nathan Ellis, who had taken a personal role in ensuring justice was served. Nathan wasn't just an FBI official now, he was a fierce advocate for his former commander, a man who had once saved his life in the jungles of Vietnam. Today, Nathan was determined to repay that debt in full. The opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp and eloquent woman named Rebecca Morales, stood to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was firm, each word cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "This case is about more than one man," she began, gesturing toward James. "It is about a system that allowed two officers to believe they could fabricate charges, abuse their power, and silence a man who did nothing but sit peacefully in a diner." She paused, letting her words sink in. James Carter is a decorated Vietnam veteran, a man who fought for this country's freedom. Yet in his own home, in the land he defended, he was treated as a criminal because of the color of his skin. This is not justice. And today, we are here to make sure these officers answer for their actions. Across the courtroom, Bradley and Miller sat at the defense table, their lawyers whispering furiously. Both officers wore expressions of forced calm, but the nervous glances they exchanged betrayed their unease. The testimonies. The diner waitress. The first witness was the waitress from the diner, her hands trembling slightly as she took the stand. She recounted the events of that day in vivid detail, the calm demeanor of James, the aggressive behavior of the officers, and the moment they fabricated charges to justify the arrest. "They wouldn't listen to anyone," she said, her voice cracking. "James didn't do anything wrong. He was just sitting there, drinking his coffee. They were looking for a reason to arrest him." Her testimony was supported by surveillance footage from the diner, which showed James sitting quietly before the officers approached. The video captured the escalation, the handcuffing, and the look of quiet dignity on James's face as he was led out. Community witnesses. Several other witnesses took the stand, including customers who had been at the diner that day. Each testimony painted the same picture: James was innocent, and the officers had abused their authority. The community's support for James was palpable, their voices steady and unwavering as they recounted the injustice they had witnessed. The flashbacks. As the trial unfolded, James found himself reflecting on his time in Vietnam. The jungle was a far cry from the courtroom, but the battles he had fought there felt eerily similar to the one he was fighting now. He remembered the day he met Nathan Ellis, a young, scared soldier who had been thrust into the chaos of war. In one vivid memory, James recalled pulling Nathan out of an ambush, bullets whizzing past as they scrambled for cover. "Stay low, keep moving," James had barked, his voice steady despite the danger. Nathan had followed him without question, his trust absolute. That trust had been forged in fire. And now, decades later, it was being tested in a new kind of war, a war for justice. The turning point. The defense team tried to paint a different picture of Bradley and Miller. Their lawyer argued that the officers had been acting within their rights, claiming James had been uncooperative and threatening. But the evidence stacked against them was overwhelming. Nathan Ellis took the stand next, his testimony a powerful indictment of the officers and the system that had enabled them. "James Carter is the reason I'm standing here today," Nathan began, his voice steady but emotional. "He saved my life more times than I can count. He taught me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. And that's why I'm here, to make sure he gets the justice he deserves." Nathan detailed the FBI's investigation, highlighting the pattern of misconduct within the precinct. His words carried weight, not just because of his position, but because of the conviction in his voice. He wasn't just testifying as an FBI official, he was speaking as a man who owed his life to James. The verdict. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide the office's fate. On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of falsifying charges, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty. The words rang out like a bell, each one a step closer to justice. Bradley and Miller's faces turned pale, their bravado evaporating as the weight of their actions came crashing down. The judge sentenced them to significant prison time, emphasizing the severity of their crimes. "This court will not tolerate the abuse of power," she said. "Today, we send a message that no one is above the law." The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as news of the verdict spread. Reporters clamored for statements, but James kept his words brief. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Nathan stood beside him, his hand resting on James's shoulder. "You've always been a fighter," Nathan said quietly. "And because of you, Things are going to change. A legacy of change. In the months that followed, the fallout from the case rippled across the city. The precinct underwent a complete overhaul, with several officers resigning or being dismissed. New policies were implemented to ensure greater accountability and transparency. The case became a national talking point, sparking conversations about systemic reform and the importance of standing up to injustice. James, despite his reluctance for the spotlight, became a symbol of resilience and hope. He spoke at community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to fight for what was right. His words resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring them to take action in their own communities. A quiet moment. One evening, months after the trial, James and Nathan sat together on the porch of James's modest home. The sun was setting, casting the world in hues of gold and orange. Nathan handed James a cold beer, and the two men sat in companionable silence. "You ever think we'd end up here?" Nathan asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. James chuckled softly. "Not exactly, but we've been through worse. Haven't we?" Nathan nodded, his expression turning serious. "You changed my life, James, and now, you've changed so many others." James looked out at the horizon, his face thoughtful. "I just did what needed to be done. That's all any of us can do." The two men sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, their bond stronger than ever. Closing reflections. James's story became a reminder that even in the face of adversity, one person's courage could spark a movement. His fight for justice wasn't just his own, it was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they served as a testament to the strength it took to overcome them. James Carter's legacy was one of resilience, hope, and an unwavering belief in the power of justice. And in the quiet moments of his life, he found peace knowing he had made a difference. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and amplifies the sound of your own heartbeat. James Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture as straight as if he were still wearing his uniform. Decades of discipline had taught him to hold his head high. But this moment was heavier than any battlefield. The war now was not fought with bullets but with words, laws, and the hope that the truth could pierce through layers of corruption. Nathan Ellis, seated beside James, cast a glance toward him. They didn't need to speak, their connection went beyond words. This wasn't just about clearing James's name, it was about exposing a broken system and ensuring no one else had to endure what James had. Nathan's jaw tightened as the defense attorneys shuffled their papers, preparing their arguments. He'd seen men like Bradley and Miller before, men who hid behind their badges, believing themselves untouchable. But today, their time was up. The weight of testimonies. The prosecution wasted no time calling their witnesses. Rebecca Morales, the lead prosecutor, was relentless, her every word a precise blow to the defense's crumbling narrative. First to testify was Sarah Jensen, the waitress from the diner. She sat stiffly in the witness box, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. The courtroom leaned in as she recounted the events of that fateful afternoon. "They came in like they were looking for trouble," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Mr. Carter was just sitting there, minding his business. He didn't do anything to provoke them. They just wouldn't leave him alone." Rebecca guided her gently. "And what did you see when the officers confronted Mr. Carter?" Sarah's eyes welled up as she spoke. "They accused him of things he didn't do. When he didn't respond the way they wanted, they arrested him. It wasn't right." The defense attorney attempted to discredit her, but Sarah held firm. "I know what I saw," she said, her voice stronger now. "They were wrong." Her testimony was supported by the diner's surveillance footage, which was played for the jury. The video captured everything: James sitting quietly, Bradley and Miller approaching, the escalating confrontation, and finally, James being handcuffed and led away. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the footage revealed the office's aggression and James's calm dignity. The community speaks. Next, Rebecca called several other witnesses, including Tom Barnes, a retired teacher who had been in the diner that day. His testimony was impassioned, his words laced with anger. "I've lived in this town my whole life," Tom said, glaring at the defense table. "I've seen things like this happen before. But this time, I'm not staying silent. James Carter did nothing wrong. Those officers, they abused their power." Tom's words resonated with the jury. their faces reflecting a mix of shock and indignation. As more witnesses came forward, a pattern of misconduct began to emerge, not just in the diner incident but in the precinct's history as a whole. The FBI's case. When Nathan Ellis took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. His commanding presence filled the space, his reputation as a high-ranking FBI official preceding him. "Mr. Ellis," Rebecca began, "you've conducted an independent investigation into the conduct of officers Bradley and Miller. Can you share your findings with the court?" Nathan nodded, his voice calm but firm. The FBI uncovered a history of misconduct within the precinct, particularly involving these two officers. Over the years, there have been multiple complaints of excessive force and falsified charges. Many of these complaints were ignored or buried by the precinct's leadership. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. In James Carter's case, the officers fabricated charges to justify their actions. There is no evidence that Mr. Carter resisted or posed any threat. In fact, the evidence shows quite the opposite. He remained calm and compliant throughout the encounter. The defense attempted to rattle Nathan with aggressive cross-examination, but he remained unshaken. His testimony was a nail in the coffin for Bradley and Miller. Their misconduct laid bare before the court. The defense crumbles. Bradley and Miller's defense grew increasingly desperate. Their lawyer tried to paint them as officers doing their duty under challenging circumstances. But the weight of evidence against them was insurmountable. When Bradley took the stand, his arrogance was palpable. "I was just doing my job," he insisted, his tone defiant. "If Carter hadn't been so difficult, this wouldn't have happened." Rebecca's cross-examination was swift and devastating. "Difficult?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "Do you mean sitting quietly in a diner and drinking coffee? Or do you mean refusing to tolerate your unwarranted aggression?" Bradley faltered, his bravado slipping. The jury's faces were grim, their patience for his excuses wearing thin. The verdict. After days of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. The hours stretched on, tension thick in the air. James sat quietly, his hands folded on the table, his expression calm but his heart racing. Nathan stayed by his side, offering silent support. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding a folded piece of paper. The room fell silent as the judge asked for the verdict. "On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of falsifying charges, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty." Gasps and murmurs erupted in the courtroom. James closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Justice, long overdue, had finally been served. Sentencing and impact. The judge didn't hold back during sentencing. Bradley and Miller received lengthy prison sentences. Their careers in law enforcement permanently ended. The judge's words were clear and unyielding. "This court will not tolerate abuse of power by those sworn to protect and serve." The case sparked national attention, becoming a rallying cry for police reform. Activists used James's story as a platform to demand accountability, and local officials began implementing changes to address systemic issues within law enforcement. James's speech. At a community rally held in the wake of the trial, James addressed a crowd of supporters. His voice was steady but emotional as he spoke. "This victory isn't just mine," he said, looking out at the sea of faces. "It belongs to everyone who stood up, spoke out, and refused to let injustice go unchallenged. This fight is far from over. But today, we proved that change is possible." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices united in chants for justice and equality. A quiet victory. In the months that followed, James returned to his quiet life, though he remained a symbol of resilience and hope for many. Nathan visited often, their bond stronger than ever. On one such visit, they sat on James's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You've done a lot of good, James," Nathan said, handing him a glass of iced tea. "Not just for yourself but for so many others." James smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We've done a lot of good," he corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared journey lightened by the knowledge that they had made a difference. Closing reflections. James Carter's fight for justice became a turning point, not just for his community but for countless others who drew strength from his story. His courage and resilience were a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, One person could ignite change. In the quiet moments of his life, James found peace knowing that his actions had helped pave the way for a better future. And though the scars of his battle remained, they were a testament to the strength it took to fight and win a war for justice. The courtroom was a crucible, and James Carter's trial had become its defining moment. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with more people crowding the hallways outside, waiting for any word. This was no longer just about James, it had become a battleground for truth, accountability, and change. Activists, journalists, and community members had gathered in solidarity, their collective energy buzzing like an unrelenting storm. At the plaintiff's table, James sat beside Nathan Ellis and Rebecca Morales, the lead prosecutor. James's face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of decades of battles fought, not just on foreign soil but in the country he called home. Nathan, his sharp suit immaculate, leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "You've got this." James nodded subtly, his gaze steady. He was a soldier at heart, and this was just another mission. But this time, his weapon wasn't a rifle, it was the truth. A shocking witness. The day began with Rebecca calling an unexpected witness, Officer Marcus Wright, a colleague of Bradley and Miller. The defense had fought to keep him off the stand, but Rebecca's persistence had paid off. As Marcus took his oath and sat down, the gallery murmured in surprise. Rebecca approached him slowly, her every movement deliberate. "Officer Wright, you've worked at the precinct for over 10 years, correct?" "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice steady but cautious. "And during that time, you've worked closely with Officers Bradley and Miller?" "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca's voice softened, but her words cut deep. "Can you describe their behavior on the force?" Marcus hesitated, glancing toward the defense table. Bradley glared at him, his jaw tight, while Miller's expression was harder to read. After a long pause, Marcus spoke. They bent the rules. A lot, he admitted, especially when it came to people of color." The room erupted into murmurs. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. Rebecca pressed on. "Officer Wright, did you ever witness them fabricate charges or escalate situations unnecessarily?" Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of his decision visibly pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, I've seen them do it." The defense attorney leapt to his feet, objecting, but the damage was done. Marcus's testimony had cracked the foundation of Bradley and Miller's defense. A painful flashback. As Marcus spoke, James found his thoughts drifting back to Vietnam. The humid jungle, the deafening sound of gunfire, and the ever-present smell of smoke and earth filled his mind. He remembered a young Nathan Ellis, trembling but determined, standing shoulder to shoulder with him during an ambush. "Stay low," James had barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Bullets zipped past them, and James had shielded Nathan with his body, firing back with unerring precision. "We get out of this together. You hear me?" Nathan's nod had been shaky, but it was enough. James had carried him then, both literally and figuratively, through the jungle and back to safety. And now, all these years later, Nathan was standing by his side once more, not as a scared young soldier but as a man determined to repay the debt. The defense crumbles. As the trial continued, the defense grew increasingly desperate. Their strategy relied on character assassination, attempting to paint James as uncooperative and combative. They brought up minor incidents from his past, trying to tarnish his reputation. But Rebecca was ready. "Mr. Carter served this country for 20 years, she said during her rebuttal. "He risked his life so that we could sit here today and argue the merits of justice. Are we to believe that a man with a spotless military record suddenly became a danger because he drank coffee at a diner?" Her words struck a chord. The jury members exchanged glances, their skepticism toward the defense growing. The FBI strikes back. Nathan Ellis returned to the stand, this time armed with damning evidence from the FBI's investigation. He presented a timeline of complaints against Bradley and Miller, supported by internal memos that revealed the precinct's history of burying misconduct reports. "These officers weren't just rogue," Nathan said, his voice cold and precise. "They were protected by a culture of complacency and corruption. And that ends here." Rebecca displayed the diner's surveillance footage once more, this time alongside a map of complaints filed against Bradley and Miller. The visual impact was undeniable. It wasn't just one incident, it was a pattern. A community rises, Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds gathered with signs and banners, chanting slogans like, "Justice for James," and "End police corruption." James's case had galvanized the community, turning quiet frustrations into a powerful movement. James's neighbors, many of whom had known him for years, spoke to reporters about his character. "He's the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back," said one elderly woman. "They picked the wrong person to mess with." The movement grew beyond the courtroom. Social media lit up with hashtags and videos of the trial, drawing national attention. Politicians and activists weighed in, calling for broader police reform and an end to systemic injustice. The verdict. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the case evident in their somber expressions. When they finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, unfolding the piece of paper that held the verdict. On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of falsifying charges, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty. The room erupted into applause and cheers. But James remained seated, his hands clasped tightly together. A single tear slid down his cheek, a release of the pressure that had built over weeks of fighting for his dignity. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "This case serves as a reminder that those who abuse their power will be held accountable. Justice has been served." Bradley and Miller's faces were pale, their once confident demeanor shattered. The bailiff led them out in handcuffs, their own chains of bitter irony. The aftermath. In the days following the trial, the precinct underwent sweeping changes. The chief resigned under pressure, and an external review led to the dismissal of several officers involved in misconduct. New policies were implemented, emphasizing accountability and transparency. For James, the victory was bittersweet. He had fought and won, but the scars of the ordeal remained. Still, he found solace in the knowledge that his fight had sparked something bigger than himself. A new chapter. Months later, James stood before a packed auditorium at a community event. The crowd quieted as he stepped up to the microphone, his presence commanding yet humble. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty," he began. "It's about building a world where people don't have to fear those who are supposed to protect them. It's about standing up, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible." His words carried the weight of experience, resonating with everyone in the room. The applause that followed was deafening, a collective acknowledgement of his courage and resilience. Reflections on the porch. On a quiet evening, Nathan visited James at his home. The two men sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Nathan handed James a cold beer, and they clinked bottles in silent celebration. "You did it," Nathan said, his voice full of admiration. "We did it," James corrected, a faint smile tugging at his lips. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey behind them. For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace. He had fought for justice, and he had won, not just for himself but for everyone who needed to believe that change was possible. A legacy of hope. James Carter's story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that one person's courage could spark a movement. His fight wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about challenging a broken system and demanding better. And though the battle for justice continued, James's victory stood as proof that change could begin with a single act of defiance. In the end, James found solace not in the spotlight but in the quiet moments, knowing he had made a difference. And in those moments, he could finally rest, his legacy secure.